Yes, welcome back. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik 16 from Plates and Crates. And no, I stopped Ridin Dirty a long time ago. But since that is the album that we're talking about by none other than UGK, let's go straight into category 2 where we review the rap performance on this classic album. And I'm excited. If you have not already, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, and let's get into it. All right, first dimension that we go over in category 2 is dimension 1. How much personality and charisma did Pimp C and Bun B display on this album? I mentioned, when we were talking in video 1 about the intentional mood or tone, that Pimp C is a huge part of that mood and tone because his personality is plastered all throughout this album, and he is the glue. He's the captain, but he's also the heart and soul. And so I think, to talk about Pimp C's presence on track without talking about his personality, it's almost impossible, and it does a disservice to his legacy because that's what you're getting. And a lot of times, for the fans or people who stumble across this album as maybe their first foray into UGK, this album was an introduction to how Pimp C really is what you see and what you get. He starts one of his verses on 3 in the morning, his verse on 3 in the morning with that. What you see is what the F you get. And it shows. You'll recognize it as soon as you hear that signature, hold up. And that is either a happenstance or a skill set to be able to push the personality you want everyone to be aware of effectively on wax. Not everyone can do it. Shoot, I think I've struggled with that as a rapper. So, with Pimp C, he's saying his credo on most songs. He's saying words to live by, and even in the exaggerated glorification moments, he's pushing it out with so much passion and so much emphasis on what he doesn't deal with and what he does deal with, that it's like, okay. Bun B, on the other hand, there's personality there too, and it's a mix. It's a really interesting mix because he's like this bear-like figure in hip-hop, and he shows up to do a particular job that he's called in for. But with Bun B, there was always this wise before his years quality that comes through on wax, where you understood they're in the same age bracket. They're the same age. They're two young men in their 20s when this album was out. Talking on things that most, rap males in their 20s, especially young black rap males in their 20s talk on, but there was always this twinge, and it could be because of his tone that had, an awareness and a patience, an insight, a foresight, and kind of this uncle, grandpa feel, but still encompassed in a young man, if that makes sense. Pimp C also gives you uncle vibes too, but young, reckless uncle who was clearly taught by old timers, because both rappers, I think, what comes through is a lot of that traditional Southern sentiment, which is part of that whole Southern pride ethos that permeates the album, right? So, you're getting two dynamic personalities that balance each other out. If Bun B is the calmer side, Pimp C is the, I'll hop out this whip right now and tell you about yourself side. And they're both gonna tell you about themselves because they're both saying it in their raps, but just Pimp C is just a little bit more boisterous with it. And Bun B is a little bit more measured, but they're both coming with this young oldness. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 2, the question of suspension of disbelief or believability. Now, there's no suspension of disbelief being asked of you on this album. There's no characters. There's no Sweet James yet. there's just Pimp C and Bun B, and it's all about their neighborhood or their part of Texas. And it's all about Texas, and it's all about the South, and it's all about the lifestyle that they're presenting, which from an observation standpoint, well, it sounds like regular, street rap. Their version of street rap is careful. It totes the line of being reckless and careful. So cautiously reckless, if that makes sense. I say that because you get examples of, let's say, the most abrasive song on here. That's Why I Carry, and F My Car. That's Why I Carry, while Bun B is taking it from an angle of being antagonized, not initiating. And this is, something I brought up when we reviewed Tupac. Tupac is rarely ever talking about initiating, if ever. I don't know if Tupac ever initiates violence in any of his raps. It's always in response to enemies, right? And that's the same way it's being talked about on this track. Now, what Pimp C does is take it from a more observational angle, shaking his head almost like, hey, this is what I seen people kill each other over. Don't kill your boy over a woman. And then we go to Touch. Pimp C gets personal there and slips some of his life, talking about, beefing with someone who was talking down to him because they were older about how to raise his son. And he goes as far as saying, don't you know I roll with killers that'll get you erased and wiped out, but you kin to my son, so hold back, but don't ever get it twisted. Which is a real personal and interesting thing to slip into a rap song. Whether it's true or not, it's hard to believe that it wouldn't be true, because it's such a specific angle to take, right? Whereas his other verse, he's talking about sleeping with somebody's girl. That's regular rap bragging, and he goes over the top with the description. But you get stuff like that, and even in that section, Pimp C makes it a point to say, I roll with killers. And later on another track, he says, my folks will blast you. Pimp and Bun rarely talk about starting drama or getting into ignorance just because they live in an ignorant lifestyle. It's more like the ills of the street life, bring this along. This is what comes with the game. And, there's a lot of reflection and contemplation throughout the album on how invested in that they want to be, because they're recognizing changes that go on. The very first song is talking about losses because of the game, and leaves them with this perspective, okay, well, what do we do knowing what we know about it? Now, I'm gonna hold up the same measuring tape that I held up to most other rappers who talk street stuff, who start in the industry as young as they do, right? If we have to do the math, both Pimp C and Bun B went to high school. Now, apparently Pimp C dropped out in the middle of high school. Bun B saw it through. So very similar to the Outkast story. But they got their record deal while still teenagers. Right after Bun B graduates high school, they get their record deal and release shortly after their debut album. So where this leaves time for these deep tales of street folklore and street involvement, that's where your level of believability based on their level of making you believe comes in, because it's like the NWA Ghetto Boys issue again, where we're like, well, how likely were you dabbling involved? And I only say this because compared to rappers that we see now, where it's almost super glorified, it's almost a prerequisite to be listened to, is seeing how many cases you caught, where if anyone can vouch for you really being a part of what you're claiming to be a part of, especially now that we have gang culture so accepted in rap in the past 20 years. You can't, it makes it a little harder to claim, because now there's also more investment in your backstory, in your history than before, where you can just kind of be there, and if you're cool with street dudes, it's cool because you're making the music they listen to, right? It's how Too Short built his whole career. It's like, oh, I'm not a pimp, but I'm gonna make these songs to impress the pimps. I'm not a drug dealer, but I'm gonna make these songs about the dope game and sell them to the actual dope dealers. And hip hop is steeped in that. You know, the older I get, the more I realize that less and less of your favorite rappers are in, you know, 5 toes in as they say they are on the records. But if they're protected enough, then cool. And so what UGK does here is they really tightrope walk. They go just enough into reckless talk to let you know that they're from the streets and they've dabbled in the streets, and they're not afraid of, you know, violence, and, you know, they treat women a certain way, but they also keep their feet planted enough where it's not overboard. They're not talking about being crime bosses or, you know, doing drive-bys. It's none of that. So it always comes down to how much do you believe UGK. If you've ever heard Bun B speak, especially when he's guest appeared on networks like ESPN, or back in the day where he was doing some adjunct college instruction, it'll throw you for a loop because he is one of the most eloquent and articulate rappers off wax. I almost feel like he plays up the Southern drawl. You know, Bun B, it almost shuts off to the point where it's like, you know, code switching is one of those interesting things that not many rappers know how to do. You know, you get a good amount of rappers in an interview in any audience, and they're kind of gonna stay the same way. They might try to put hard emphasis on some words, but they can't fake it because they don't have it in them. For Bun B to have that in him, it's like, man, either this man was really, really good at school and just chose a different route, or, you know, some of the stuff is very interesting. I'll leave it at that. So something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, and that takes us to dimension 3, the delivery and the use of voice. Since we're speaking about inflection and articulation, yeah. So we mentioned Bun B having that bear presence, that grandpa Southern drawl that gives you a little bit of the warm and traditional feeling just off tone alone. It feels familiar, it feels knowing, you know, and when it's time to warn, the warn has a seriousness, because it's almost like, oh, you know, wait till your father gets home kind of tone. And Pimp has the more exaggerated Southern drawl with a higher pitch. So he lets his words linger longer, and that's part of his emphasis on points that he wants to make. He rhymes with a little bit more emotion because he wants you to know what he's not dealing with, what he's not standing for, and then, you know, when he wants to let you know how cool he is, same way. Whereas Bun emphasizes words technically, not emotionally, you know. So when he's ready to make you really feel a word, he's gonna go. So there's a whole part. He's talking about guys that trick on women, and he kind of loses himself. And it sounds like he gets angry within this section of his verse as he's trying to express anger. It sounds like he gets angry, and that might be the one emotional time on the whole album where you hear Bun B kind of lose his own footing because he's, you know, trying to emphasize a point. And you know, for the most part, it's gonna be particular words where he really wants you to feel it and hear it. But it's more technical, where Pimp is going to rap with disgust in his voice. He's gonna rap with judgment in his voice. He's gonna rap with anger. Get that out of here kind of sentiment. And so the contrast of having this deeper, quick Southern drawl and this higher, slowed out, exaggerated Southern drawl, it works almost like hand in glove, hand in hand, because they complement one another. The contrast is great, and there's not a song on here where the two are not together. There's no solos on this particular album, and no songs where one gets more verse time than the other. They split it evenly, and when there's a guest, the guest is in their space. First verse, second verse, or last verse, or they're on the hook, and they still do what they do. But really, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, how well you think that goes together. Takes us to dimension 4, the flow. Oh, the flow. And so in category 1, I talked in depth about the cohesiveness being almost calculated through the sequencing by Pimp C. And if this is just by chance, then, you know, what an interesting chance, what an interesting roll of the dice. But it almost seems, I broke it down into looking at the album as the tape version, and the first half, side A, being the more mature, hip-hoppy, effort-based, diverse side, and the second side being the more raunchy, super Southern, super exaggerated, lazier or immature side, right? And I say that because flow matters happen in the first half that don't find themselves again until the end of the second half. So every single song on the first half has some technical rap structure that you can tell was thought about. And so on the very first song, One Day, Bun B uses a flow, and this is led mostly by Bun B, so you're gonna hear a lot of talk about Bun B when it comes to the flow, because for those first 4 or 5 songs, Bun B is the one really going out of his way to make sure he's using a different style each time. So the first one, he's using a similar sequence of rhyming words that all are poignant. And then you'll see him do that same thing on Diamonds and Wood, where he's doing an A-B rhyme structure, something that, you know, was more intricately done by Freeway, but something that not a lot of rappers try to execute. So whereas the second bar is not gonna rhyme with the first bar, the second bar rhymes and connects with the fourth bar. So he's saying, you know, these words up here, and then he says this other word, and you're like, that doesn't quite rhyme. It's the same syllable, it's the same vowel sound, but then you hear the next line, you're like, oh, that's rhyming with that, and that's rhyming with that. And so those are the kinds of things that happen in writing that you don't just do willy-nilly. You take your time and you're like, this is how I'm gonna come on this verse. Bun B also does this pattern on Pinky Ring, where most other rappers would have did any other flow. Bun B chooses to rhyme on a different part of the bar structure, where he's making his words land on the downbeat but overlapping the bar line. So he's crossing the bar line with 2-syllable words, and the thing, rap into the things to the key, so that falls over and spills into the next sequence, but he keeps that same rhyme pattern for the entire verse, which is also not easy to do. It sounds lazy in as I'm saying what it is, but when you hear it, you realize, oh, to keep that cadence, keep that amount of syllables for each line, and a bunch of rhyming words, and make it all make sense. That's mastery right there. And so, you know, you take those 3, and then you also throw in murder, which is the famous song where both Pimp and Bun B come off super duper hard, because it's really the first just straight I'm a spit song on the album, After One Day, which starts off on such a somber, soulful tone and this deep, heavy message and contemplation music. We go right into it, and Pimp C, again, I think, everything is deliberate and there's a knowing, because he's like, I'm still Pimp C. That's how he leads off, and he's keeping up the pace. Everyone always talks about Bun B's pace because he's rapping rapid fire style, no pauses, very few room for commas, and he's just leading all kinds of flow patterns. There are about 5 different flow patterns that Bun B shoots into, and in an interview he was telling the story of how he recorded this in 2 takes, and this is one of the first hip-hop tracks to be recorded on Pro Tools. Pro Tools just becoming a thing available to producers in their home studios and everything, or even in the major studios, and available to the rap world. This was a huge deal. And so having the ability to punch, but Bun B said he was determined not to punch. He refused to punch. And that is, if you ask anybody about me, I refuse. I've driven people crazy in the studio, my boys, every producer, every engineer. I apologize, but I refuse to punch unless some dire circumstances going. I want to be able to have breath control, and so I totally relate to that. And to hear this verse, knowing there was no cuts, no punches, and he did this in 2 takes. And now this is considered one of the most legendary verses in hip-hop history. Bun B is doing some things on there that are beyond technical. He's doing rollovers into these internal rhymes and hollow rhymes that effortlessly switch into different patterns without even needing to announce them. But he does because he wants to emphasize certain syllable sounds and vowel sounds when he gets to them. So when he goes into the cluckers and, they love us like nunchuckers, and or even the one to take me back to jail, oh hell no, that O being connected to it bounces, it machine guns. He does everything you want a rapper to do in one verse with amazing breath control. It earns its reputation. And again, I mentioned Pimp C keeping at the same pace as Bun B. They're both attacking that beat because this is one of the most hip-hop sounding beats on that album. And Bun B had noted that UGK was known for having slower grooves. They were doing slower, smoky Southern music, and Pimp C was saying, here's your chance, Bun, to spit, because Bun was saying he wanted a track he could really go off on. Pimp C made this up-tempo, relentless 808 super hip-hop track, and that's exactly what both of them did on there. And so you needed Pimp to start that off because it made Bun B's verse sound like this was the knife and this is the gun. So you got stabbed and shot. Murder. And those are just the first 4 songs. Now, when you get to 3 in the morning, Pimp C steps it up a notch and does this trade-off of 2 different flows. He decides to use 2 separate flows for every 4 bars. So he'll do a straightforward flow. Like moving down up the and he goes back and forth between those 2 flows. Again, these are not things you do accidentally. These boys went in knowing that they were going to go in with that pen. And there's another thing that Pimp C does on the song Diamonds and Wood, which is the staccato flow that plenty of Southern rappers created. They created this flow because of the nature of their slower beats in the early 90s, where it called for you having to really stretch out your syllables and rhyme like a drum. to keep a steady pace and to keep the attention. So Pimp C is doing that classic. It's almost like a drum roll, but a slow down drum roll. And you hear a lot of No Limit rappers who have done that. A lot of the Texas rappers were doing that, but Pimp C does it so effortlessly, so smoothly. What happens on the second half of the album, it sounds like some of the effort slides, because when you get to F My Car, you know, there's parts where, you know, I mentioned Bun B losing it. He goes into this sequence of just saying the F word like 5 times to lead out his verse, and he's doing it more like he's cursing somebody out instead of keeping a flow. He's just like, what are you know, and then Pimp C goes off beat in his verse too, and they're both doing straightforward flow patterns there, you know, standard Southern flow patterns in that song, so nothing intricate. They don't pick it back up until That's Why I Carry. Bun B is doing more connecting word rhymes where he's, you know, swinging from one word to another, but still, you know, nothing, no tricks, no special, you know, techniques for the flows there. Good stuff. They pick up the pace again the same way they did on Pinky Ring and Murder, and they are attacking that beat. Pimp C just comes in from the gate. And then Ridin Dirty, they mellow out to fit the mellowness of the Wes Montgomery sample, because it's a jazz song, and it's the last song on the album. High Life. Yeah, to not come back with, you know, that level of spitting until the end, it almost feels like you got spoiled. You know, it just feels like the listeners were spoiled on the first half with all of this like deliberate, technical, rapidy rap stuff. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5, where we talk about wordplay and bar intent. And so we're talking about Bun B choosing words that all rhyme but still make sense. The more complex the structure doesn't mean that the word usage has to get more complex. Bun B says very relatively simple, grounded stuff, you know. Comparing blood to red jelly spilling out your belly isn't like the craziest thing, right? Or, you know, when I'm wetter than a river, simple, but he makes them fit. And so when we talk about the actual words being used here, UGK is not trying to use lyrical trickery. They're trying to get their point across, even though they do a lot of technical things structure-wise with how they want to bring it across. They're still saying very straightforward things. So there's not a lot of simile, there's not a lot of metaphor. Sometimes they speak in, you know, Southern wisdom and idioms and things like that, but you're not getting much more than imagery and, you know, comparative language, a little bit of slick talk. The similes are gonna be intermediate. They're not amateur and elementary level, but they're also not rewind factor level. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. It takes us to dimension 6, and that is the punchlines, poetic wisdom, and overall quotability. Pimp C, one of the most quoted rappers in rap history, mostly by other Southern rappers and Southern fans, but and that all goes back to this idea that his personality is the pulse of the album, you know, the pulse of what's making this album pop, because Pimp C is going to say things like your relative who really does not give a damn. And so when Pimp C says what you should have done or what you should not be doing and admonishing you, then it's something that's memorable because he's saying it with the familiarity of someone that you've probably heard in your life say it with, or someone you've never heard in your life, and you're like, what makes this guy tick? let me get into why he's, saying such bold assertions. And it's assertions out the wazoo. I mean, he is telling you what he's on. Bun B the same way. You're being admonished. Lots of warning talk in his verses. So it's less bragging and more about what he does not want you to make him do, because he knows he's capable of it. And that's Bun B's style of bragging. It's like, this is what it can come to. I don't want it to come to this, but now you done let it get there, right? And so the things that they say on the more contemplative tracks are also what people gravitate towards. So there's the entertainment value of the brashness of Pimp C, and then the wisdom that falls somewhere in between is the other side of that coin, where it's like, man, you're right. So on their more topical songs, you're getting Southern wisdom. So even though, again, these are young men, you're still getting that quotability factor, because they're saying things that weren't yet said on wax and remain true now from the first song. Now, even the chorus, even the term F my car, the idea that a rapper saying, look, I got this dope car and this woman's giving me attention, but she don't even want me, she want my car, as a commentary on the materialism of the women they meet. It's poetic wisdom right there alone, just the title alone. Just one day you're here and then you're gone. These are the things you get from Southern wisdom. These are the things that are effortless for rappers like Andre 3000 and Lil Wayne, because these are things they grew up hearing. It's so easy for our Southern people, our Southern folk, our Southern family, our Southern ancestors to just throw, speak in these kind of parable sayings. If you want to pick out particular lines that have been quoted, we know famously Jay-Z used the introductory line from Touch off Bun B's verse for 99 Problems, which also borrows from an Ice-T song of the same title. But what Jay-Z did for that verse is what Jay-Z has done for a lot of rappers' careers, using their lines and making them, well-known or globally known on a wide platform, or a wider platform than they originally got to shine on. So, that just shows you the staying power and the impact of some of the verses and some of the things being said on there. Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. They're not punchline rappers. All right, Dimension 7, concepts. All right, there are concepts on it. They're light. F My Car is conceptual. So is, you can say that Pinky Ring is loosely conceptual. And, Ridin Dirty, the title track, is loosely conceptual. Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to Dimensions 8 and Dimensions 9, the content. Dimension 8 being externalized content, how much are UGK talking about things outside of themselves, outside of their own heads, things going on around them, things going on in the world. And Dimension 9, internalized content, how much are UGK talking about what's going on in their head and their hearts. So, externalized. We mentioned how there's a lot of topical songs on this album. It's a short album. It stays in that safe zone. And even though some of the themes are, pretty much the same, the topics are different. So, F My Car, we just talked about that. Touched And that's why I carry. It may sound like they're about the same thing. The two most abrasive songs. You can throw Murder in there, but I feel like Murder sounds more hip hop, more grassroots hip hop, and less abrasive because the pacing of it. So the more slowed down funk style of Touched, and that's why I carry, leaves it more open. Plus these are more open productions and more open flows to hear what's being said. And so Touch is more scenario based. You know, they're each telling these 4 different types of ways that people ask for trouble involving them. And so, you know, the first verse, Bun B's telling it in the story version. His second half verse, he's approaching it as an observer of people just throwing monkey wrenches in the game or messing up the game of talking to women because they're being tricks and catching feelings over it. Pimp C does the same thing in way more detail on his second verse. For his half verse, he is again sharing that personal story about beefing with the family member to his son, about how to raise his own kid, and doing it in a threatening way. But on That's Why I Carry, he's more trying to throw out some hood wisdom. Bun B is talking more like, man, if this happens one more time, this is what it's going to have to come to. This is the violence that I will meet you with, and this is what I'll have to, you know, do. So, similar themes, meaning this is, at the end of the day, it's all about I will shoot you. I will wipe you out and address you, especially Pimp C. On his second verse of Touch, he goes way off the deep end into some just darker, deeper territory. He becomes the person with the manpower. You know, instead of saying I got people that do it, he goes and says he's gonna kidnap and, you know, all this craziness, all this really violent stuff, which is only exacerbated by 3-2 doing different hooks each time, up in the ante, talking about, you know, killing someone in front of their kids. Is, you know, again, black men in their 20s, there's something about wanting to push the buttons of how, you know, hyperbolic we can get in rap. And, you know, these are just 2 different approaches. And so Pinky Ring and Good Stuff, if you're not listening, those are 2 other songs that sound like they're about the same thing. But Pinky Ring is really a more in the role of a pimp. These are all the ways that I'm like a pimp. I'm even dressing like a pimp. Don't you see my jewelry? You know, I told you I'm a pimp. It's in my name. You know, it's the sentiment from Pimp C. He's describing all these material things he has and how he gets the women, the kind of women he gets. Bun B is more or less talking to the woman in second person about the lifestyle he can introduce her to and the time he can spend with her. Good Stuff is more like a get with me because this is how fly I am. And that's the angle that's coming from. So again, similar theme, different topical approach. And High Life and One Day, those are also the matching pairs there, because one song begins the album and the other kind of leads it out. It's towards the end, and they're compliments to each other. One Day, they're all reflecting on people they've lost and the fragility of life. It's a somber, reflective song, whereas High Life is more contemplative. These are the 2 thinking out loud. After they've taken you on this ride of possibly pistol whipping enemies and dealing with superficial women and being just as superficial and misogynistic back, they're now questioning how this goes in with their better judgment and the Southern wisdom that's been instilled in them from their upbringing, you know, from family wisdom. Pimp C's talking about what his mother wanted for him or what she wants for him, and what his grandmother wanted for him and what she wanted for him, and his faith, his spirituality. And Bun B is doing the same on this verse. It's about the state of black life and living below the poverty line and the average struggle and stress that comes with dabbling in the streets. Something that you hear also on Diamonds and Wood, but more 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And so Diamonds and Wood and 3 in the Morning, they're half bragging and half thinking out loud. But High Life is completely thinking out loud. And so by the time you get to Ridin Dirty, it's a mix of everything. And it's a good way. It's probably the only way the album should have ended anyway. So there's plenty of content on there when you break it down like that and you think about the fact that this is a 12-song album, and clearly they had things to say and different ways of saying them. Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Final dimension 10, storytelling. There's stories all throughout this album, And now, once upon a time, not long ago, I mentioned it, Ridin Dirty title track has story elements. One Day has lots of narrative approaches, and Touched has a whole bunch of narrative approaches. And then all the other songs kind of go in and out of having story portions and just present tense braggadocio. But how well do the men tell stories on this album? How well do Pimp C and Bun B tell stories on this album? That is subjective. And I think because there's no straight chronological from beginning to end story song on this album, that's something for you to consider whether or not you think it's a weakness or if the storytelling elements on this album are just fine on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And with that, we conclude the Category 2 review of the classic album by UGK, Ridin Dirty, 1996. Y'all know what it is. Thank y'all for rocking so far. It only gets better. If you have not, go visit theraprouleur.com. You can cast your votes, add to the ranking, the overall pool of percentages, so we can figure out who's closest to the average. And then there's prizes to be gotten. There's cash, there's food, there's drinks, there's shirts and merch and books. And the app is coming soon. If you don't feel like going to theraprouleur.com, you're bugging, but feel free to please leave your comments and rankings under the YouTube video. That's why you're here, and you'd like to subscribe to the channel, right? If not, smash that like button right now. Now, also, still taking requests, still building this global hip-hop community. Stay tuned. We're jumping into the next video. Until next time, A RAP CRITIC. We talk about it while I live in words and meth.